The right to buy is a scheme introduced across the United Kingdom in 1980, which gives tenants of council houses the right to purchase their homes or council housing units at a massive discount. By 1984, the maximum discount allowed was 70%, which is absolutely mad when you consider how expensive housing is and how much it can cost the government. This is obviously an immensely popular policy. Despite opposition from some sort of, silly Labour councillors, the scheme proved an instant success for the Tories as it enabled millions of Britons to secure their housing rights for the foreseeable future, being a prime piece of populist political rhetoric for the Tories as the great housing heroes and economic liberalisers of the 20th century.
So if we had to go to Wikipedia, search up historical rankings, Prime Ministers of the United Kingdom, then we go down to opinion of members of Parliament, and we find something funny. So there's like this strange conservative woman who was in office for like 10 years, ranked above the GOAT, and some weird war criminal.
The right to buy was introduced by Margaret Thatcher, in fact, and remains one of her most enduringly popular policies. For many Britons, particularly poorer individuals for whom the right to buy allowed them to securely build families, contribute to the economy through their newly secured home ownership, it has created a constant, unending devotion to Margaret Thatcher. Currently, though, there's all this talk about a housing crisis and worse still, a greater cost of living one. A housing crisis caused by a shortage of housing stock for ordinary people, sure. A cost of living crisis caused, partially, by the constantly raising price of what little stock there is. Let's talk about why I hate the right to buy, or maybe less succinctly, why Thatcher's broader housing policy across her entire time in office, particularly that Housing Act of 1980, through which the right to buy was introduced, has brought the British economy to this utterly shite place today. The policy was so popular, Labour literally dropped their opposition to the right to buy in the space of an election cycle, so what gives? Oops. To start with, the Housing Act coincided with a severe defunding of council house construction, with numbers dwindling from around 80,000 social housing units in 1980 to only 18,000 in the year of 2000, 20 years later, a number I hope you understand is not reflective whatsoever of population growth and change in the UK over the 20-year period. The result of this is relatively simple. The people buying their council homes were not necessarily representative of a poor working class brought up to middle class home ownership by a sort of prudent spending policy, but instead largely employed in high skilled jobs themselves, living in council housing as a sort of transitional way of housing a family and securing that living for a while before they kind of graduated to the middle class. In terms of a Max Weber sort of social status definition, we would consider them kind of bordering upon being like a, middling social status. They usually new homeowners, for example. The vast majority of those who did not purchase were those who had slim chances of housing without the reduced rent of council houses. Lower skilled workers, people suffering from unemployment, young people, single parents. The right to buy created an intense devotion to Thatcher as it enabled a housing security leap for an entire generation, but this came at the expense of a majority of other tenants, not to mention any future tenants, which is the big issue today. Councils in the UK spend 2 billion quid every year on temporary accommodation, which is usually hostels, hotels, etc., for homeless people. And yet Thatcher is touted as some mega-brained, pragmatic neoliberal who saved Britain from this, lefty financial ruin, when she in fact created a greater amount of financial ruin through her silly policy and then enshrined it in the law, which now people are too ideologically silly to change. And that really gets to the core of what I dislike about the right to buy. It objectively does not benefit tenants. Even if you exclude the fact that, Thatcher's housing minister, his kid bought like 40 council homes as an investment and spun them from £5,000 to £250,000. Obviously less impressive when you consider a decade or so of inflation. That's still mental. Around 4 out of 10, 41%, of council housing units are currently owned by private landlords. That's obviously caused, small cases of gentrification throughout, particularly London, where it gave accessibility to otherwise very expensive land. But on a much deeper level, it's contributed to the housing crisis in cities across the UK. As a Londoner myself, homelessness is an extremely normalised part of everyday life. Poverty rate in the UK has soared since Thatcher's time. Homelessness population in London coincides with that. London faces a literal housing number problem, with affordable housing solutions seeing private developers regularly skirt the rules to avoid contributing anything to society at the expense of a profit margin. When combined with decreasing social housing stock as a result of right to buy, constant house price increase as that stock gets more scarce, and a refusal from the government to create more social housing, a housing crisis is logically what you're going to get. Even in spite of the right to buy's more specific or era-specific issues, it's created this long-term scarcity of affordable housing access, thus normalizing a structural violence against those in poverty, depriving them of their UN-enshrined right to shelter, and then therefore directly contributing to the housing crisis of today. So I was actually talking to my dad about this, and a very common counter-argument, one that he actually brought up, is that this problem would simply be resolved by building more homes to match the stock. And in my mind, that simply misses the point. Currently, housing purchases are 8-1 with constructions as a result of right to buy. Council housing stock is depleting massively, with over 1 million families in the UK currently waitlisted for residence as the result of this major housing crisis. The right to buy literally impedes the effectiveness of any homes built, and when 40% of those 8-1 end up in private ownership, that contributes to this ever-growing basic rent. It is not viable to maintain a council housing program unless social housing unit construction in the UK reaches hundreds of thousands per year. I believe it's currently somewhere around, if you include all social housing units, like I think 30,000. And it would literally need to octuple, which is not feasible within anyone's budget. Another common argument I've seen is that councils should start buying old rundown homes and preparing them for residents as a means of bolstering housing stock in the UK. I'm not necessarily opposed to this, but councils have their own very severe problems with out-of-use rundown council homes that need refurbishing and are already in their ownership. I think this rebuying strategy is a viable option, particularly in cities where space is scarce, albeit with the consideration of higher basic costs due to that expensive land. But it needs to be done in tandem with refurbishing decrepit old council houses and constructing new ones, and removing or severely limiting the RTB along with that. I just want to add, I don't think that this is without precedent either, right? Because in Scotland and Wales, both of them have removed the right to buy, unlike Britain. And they've basically cited similar reasons to me. In a time of a housing crisis, you can't be constantly depleting the social housing stock. And for Scotland, for example, this allowed them around 14,000 housing units, which they could then, begin planning, begin filling with disadvantaged people who need housing. That's the equivalent in the UK, because Scotland's about, in Britain, because Scotland's about 1/10 of the population of Britain, of 150,000 social homes being free for the government to plan around. I mean, that's unbelievable. It's worked out successfully. The right to buy remains something Labour tiptoes around. They cap the minimum cost, but they never oppose it. And there we go. Like, the right to buy's continuing existence is, in my mind, so indicative of the failures of New Labour and Keir Labour's approach to Britain's many fiscal and social crises. Keir, for example, is terrified of making radical policy change for the benefit of society. He's promised like 600,000 homes. He's not building them. But he would never actually get to the root cause of that problem, because he fears criticism or unpopularity in a 5-year election cycle, which gives him ample time to rebuild a government's legitimacy through people's lives getting better. Blair had much the same issue, failing to properly fulfill housing demand or try and tackle the legally enshrined causes of housing shortages. The New Labour promise of equal opportunity ahead of equal outcomes means there is no ideological opposition to the RTB. Blair would have been too conservative for the Labour of the 70s that opposed it. Keir's approach is just confusing. Billions of quid towards ending homelessness, promised goals of those few thousand council houses, and yet no action taking to ensure that the housing stays for the people. If that 4 out of 10 statistic didn't make it clear enough, so long as a right to buy is in place, social housing is not social. It does not contribute to tackling inequality in Britain, especially if 8 houses are being bought for every one built. Council housing being council housing again could have huge potential benefits. I mean, after all, it literally serves as a rent that private landlords have to, at least to some degree, try and compete with in terms of affordable units. Furthermore, the housing security provided by government-subsidised rents will allow many, many more people who are unemployed, again, single parents, etc., to begin contributing properly to the UK economy. And Keir Starmer is really fond of industrial workers, it seems, so that would be big for him. In a basic Keynesian sort of labour sense, this move does promote spending and employment and everything. I reiterate, there is no problem with home ownership. Labour actually sold a few council homes back in the day. It is an objective good for housing to move into the ownership of individuals. And if the government can subsidise people and kind of create more houses and more housing equality and more homeowners, why would anyone be opposed? The problem is that right now, the RTB inherently benefits some and not others. It regularly re-enters the private market, thereby only contributing to issues of housing quality through rent prices. And it has coincided with a massive drop-off in amount of social housing construction. And the amalgamation of those factors has just created a horrible, horrible housing crisis today and a great systemic injustice being done against people in poverty. The right to buy, then, is nothing but a scourge on England. It remains a thorn in the side of governments who seem concerned about the housing crisis but ideologically opposed to resolving it, condemning this country to ever-inflating house price and ever-inflating, fucking everything. Whatever. One day the Welsh Communist Revolution will come and free us all.